Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. It's that time of year where we look towards the future. We do this every year, sort of to see what's going to, I was talking to you guys before, what's going to smack us in the face in 2019. Austin, you say that there's things that are already hitting us that are, maybe not surprises, but things that we should have seen coming.
Well, look, the future is now, Dan, with some of these things. And look, let me give my new book, Cocktails from Hell, a little push, because the analysis behind that helps readers understand why so many of these things are rooted not only in the last 5 or 6 minutes, the way they make it look on television, but in some cases 400 and 500 years ago or more. The problems in Venezuela, actually, you can see the roots of these from the 1940s and 1950s. But Venezuela is corroding right now. They're losing so many. Venezuelans have decided to flee. They're economic and political refugees simultaneously. The economy is has no heartbeat, no detectable brain waves. Maduro, who is the dictator, to compare him to Mussolini is unfair to Mussolini, which is I guess that's kind of a put down. It's a real put down, and yet they sit on. And Jim and I briefly touched on this in a strategy talk, I think a couple of weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks ago, somewhere between 300 and 400 billion barrels of oil. Proven reserves are usually put the 250 to 300 range, but there's enough. You read the oil and gas professional press. There's enough structure in there for substantially more than that. In other words, and I'm putting it at 33%, 400 billion. It's high sulfur oil, but just so you know, that's something that is useful for turning into diesel and all kinds of other products, even though it's tough, it's harder to refine it for gasoline. But that is a lot of very useful petroleum. And yet Venezuela's flat on its face, thanks to a rapacious socialist regime. There are calls from the legislature. And by the way, I'm going to write a column about this next week. Yeah, in some ways I'm a year behind because Jim covers this in the Colombia section all the time of what's the dreariness of Venezuela. But the legislature, which has a lot of opposition politicians in it. I'm talking about the legitimate one, not the fake one that Maduro kind of sort of created, 2.5, 3 years ago, is almost calling for a coup and appealing for outside intervention. Well, where would that come from? And one of the articles that I read discussing this is, are they looking for the United States to move in? And Trump says he isn't going to do it. Are they looking for Colombia? Boy, that would be a conflagration. Are they looking for Brazil? They don't know who they're looking for. They're looking for anyone. I'm talking about the opposition. Most of the people are as well. So there's something that is with us, and you can see the shape of this collapse, I would say, from the time that Hugo Chavez came to power and then proceeded to end what shreds of democracy were left in Venezuela. Already occurring. Congo. Jim and I talked about that, I know, a couple of weeks ago, and I write about Congo all the time. Well, the election was hijacked in a rather clever way by Joseph Kabila and his henchmen. There is widespread opposition to the fact that Tshisekedi won. Don't have anything against him in particular, but he compared to Fayulu, he's weak, and Kabila can exert more control over him. It was fake election again. So far, we haven't had the explosion, but there are little explosions going on all around Congo. If not all the time, 85% of the time. So do we see a new Great Congo War? I don't dismiss the possibility. I find it unlikely because there's still 16,500 UN peacekeepers there, and they're by far the strongest military force in Congo. But it's a conflagration, and it is very much with us. I will right now just go ahead and turn it over to Jim.
I think the situation has not changed much since 2018 in terms of what are the threats to world peace, shall we say. A lot of these wars are almost forever wars. In other words, they go on interminably. Now, we have had wars end. I mean, we've been covering wars. This is our 20th year in business. And before that, I did a book called How to Stop a War, which basically took a look at all the wars in the previous 200 years. And a lot of them came and went. But what struck me when we did that book back in the 80s was that there are so many areas of the world which are perpetually in conflict or reigniting because there are unresolved problems. And until those, as people like to say, the fundamental problems, well, the fundamental problems are not easy to fix. We're talking about, generations. And you can look at other parts of the world where these fundamentals have been, fixed, and you can see there's no quick fix. And that's the problem we get ourselves in the West. We think, all right, let's win this one and go home. Well, it's not that simple in many parts of the world. World War II, World War I, many parts of those two world wars were over and settled. But in many parts of the world, things don't work that way. And Central Africa is part of that. Congo is probably the worst example. It's a huge area. It was terribly misruled during the Belgian occupation, so to speak. It was actually not. The problem was it wasn't a Belgian colony. It was the personal property of the Belgian king.
King Leopold. It was his property.
And boy, was he a bad manager. You wouldn't want him as a landlord. And
read Conrad's Heart of Darkness, because that shows you that from the absolutely obscene and vicious side of what was going on in Congo at the time. It's a novel that absolutely captures the depravity. So,
yeah. But see, the other thing that comes out with Leopold and the Belgian Congo is that he basically took advantage of existing conditions. There were tribal conflicts that had been going on before he showed up. And just like the conquistadors in Central and South America, they quickly, apprised themselves of existing conflicts and took sides. And that's the easiest way to reignite a war, to have somebody else come in and, take sides. And that's why, for example, in Venezuela, nobody wants to get involved. Because it's a snake pit. It's a poison prize. All that oil, forget about it. China is probably the smartest of the foreign interveners because they're going in there and they're very cleverly. They're investing money, not a whole lot, not as much as the Venezuelans would like, but in the areas of the oil industry that the Chinese have basically taken charge of, about 10%. They've doubled production in 2018. And they're basically, it's a demonstration project for them. They want to show Venezuelans that no matter who is misruling the country, China can be depended on to do what it says it's going to do. It's going to pump more oil. It's going to take a large chunk of it for itself to pay for the loans. But it's a reliable thief as opposed to an unreliable thief. And And that basically is a big selling point in many parts of the world. China is also very active in the Congo, where a large chunk of the economy is not, how should I put it, illegal. Coltan, a lot of valuable minerals. No legitimate company can produce as much as the world wants, but less legitimate operations can. No regulations. Pay whoever you have to pay, kill whoever you have to kill, and keep production going. We see that in even a place like Afghanistan, where there was some illegal gold mining. Well, now there's legal gold mining going up there, but once you get legal gold mining, it's long overdue. They've known about those gold deposits up there for a long time, northern Afghanistan. You immediately attract two things. One, in the cold weather, when there's no crops or herds to mine full time, you attract a lot of locals who realize they always knew there was some gold there, but now these foreigners have come in and found out where the biggest concentrations are, and they sneak in. And in Afghanistan, what they were doing was digging tunnels to the professional mines, and one of these tunnels collapsed and caught 50 people in there, working away, and 30 of them are dead. That same thing is happening in northern Burma. So you have problems where more economic activity, which normally should basically bring peace, brings more conflict, because it's the question of, well, who's getting the money? Who's benefiting from this? That's the problem with oil in many parts of the world. Nigeria is a classic example. You've had low-level rebellion in the Niger River Delta, where most of the oil is, because they finally did an audit, and there have been some reform, governments in the last 20 years in Nigeria, and they basically concluded that most of the oil profits were stolen. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars worth. And they still have, from current audits, they have 20, 30 billion that they can identify, and they sort of know what black hole it disappeared into. And it's making lawyers rich in Europe, because they're litigating, about these numbered bank accounts, secret bank accounts. But we're talking about accounts with hundreds of millions of dollars in them, belonging to various kleptocracy, elite families in Nigeria, which have gotten away with this, over decades.
Jim, I'm sorry. Can I make a point about this, though, that's relevant to Congo as well as Nigeria? There is a lot of anger from, you want to call tribal leaders, the average Joe and Josephine, and the middle classes that do exist in Congo and Nigeria, because they know that this scam has been going on. That's the way Fayulu ran on that in the Congolese election, and it's well known that a lot of Nigerians are fed up with it, and that's the kind of anger that can explode. Now, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
but you're right. But see, that's another reason why China is going to have at least short-term success, because what they do is they eliminate the local middle class. The Chinese deal is that if you want us to meet our guarantees in terms of price and deadlines, finishing a project, we supply most of the labor, and that includes all the skilled labor, unskilled, and a lot of the unskilled labor. So it brings in very few jobs, and a lot of those Chinese who are brought in, whether it be Africa or different parts of the Asia, they also want the option for some of those Chinese to stay behind and help the economy. In other words, take over the economy. Because the Chinese are much more entrepreneurial. They know how to basically run a chain of stores or a distribution network and what have you. And the local dictators prefer that there not be a thriving middle class, because, as Austin points out, and you look,
they get angry. They get angry.
Well, not only can they get angry, but they know how to get organized.
Sure.
And most of your successful revolutions come from the not the rich, but the educated. That's why after World War II, the Russians eliminated the NCO, class, as it were. There were no NCOs in the Army. All supervision was done by people who were officers, because they looked at the last two revolutions, and the main source of leaders in the revolution were NCOs. So that's interesting, because it goes to show you that it's a universal problem. You don't want to just cut off the head. You want to get rid of the many potential successors. And this is a problem in many parts of the world, because there is no educated class. In fact, this is, I don't know, it's not intentionally, but in many Muslim countries where the religious conservatives have been opposed to Western education. In other words, education that is economically useful and not just politically or theologically useful. They basically find friends in whoever's the dictator du jour, because both of them realize that if you educate people with useful skills, economically useful skills, they will look around and say, well, what do we need you clowns for? Again, this is an old situation. It's not new. I mean, ancient Rome basically thrived for so long. The Republic lasted 500 years because they had a middle class. The yeoman class, the farmers who were self-sustaining, weren't, owned their own property and what have you. You had to be one of those to be in the Army. If you couldn't afford your own armor, you go in the Navy and you row a boat and have a spear next to you in case you were boarded. This keeps on working. Create a yeoman class, as it were, and you'll create national prosperity. And this is what happens to the five tigers in the Far East, the small countries, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and even Muslim countries. I mean, Malaysia did that, even though it's mostly Muslim and they have huge ethnic differences. They basically allowed Western education. They still had a lot of Muslim conservatives, but they were basically how should I put it, outnumbered and outmanned, as it were, by the more secular middle class. And that's at the key of a lot of these conflicts in places like Iraq and Syria, and even Iran, which encourages education, but they finding that they can't really control it.
I was going to make a point about Malaysia, Jim, in line with what you were saying. Malaysia still had a relationship with Singapore, and Singapore is a living example right there, right across the strait, which is the moderates within Malaysia, and there are many would point over there and say, "Hey, look at what our former
Chinese minority.
Look what they're doing," and that would cool some of the extremists. Jim, do you want to pick up a couple of other hot spots? I'm going to
actually, I brought up that theme, education and economic productivity, because it is a common thread in all of these conflicts. I mean, here, let me just run through the list. I mean, I got a list here, which I'll run, next week. Islamic terrorism, I mentioned that. A root cause of Islamic terrorism is resistance to economic change, useful economic change. Syria and the Levant, again, that is all about the Assads basically wanted to run, actually, but what they used to call real fascist, where you had a dictatorship but a free economy. They were a fairly prosperous economy. He allowed it as long as you didn't oppose his power. North Korea, another example. Now, they never had that until the 90s, until the Russian support got cut off. And suddenly, 10% of the population starved to death. But aside from that, wake-up call, they eventually legalized a lot of the black market and market activity. They had a fairly well-educated population, didn't know a lot about what really went on in the rest of the world in terms of economics, but they could read, write, count, etc. And this part of the population quickly adapted. This is seen as the major threat to the Kim dynasty, Kim rule. They won't say that the threat is internal. They keep saying, "Oh no, it's external. It's the United States, it's South Korea, etc., it's Japan." Don't look behind the screen. It's over there, the real enemy. And you got the same problem in Venezuela. what has most of the vast majority the exiles, as it were, the refugees, the first ones to go are the ones who can afford to get out, buy a plane ticket, not just make a run for the border. That's the middle class. You saw the same thing in Cuba, in late 50s, early 60s. Iran is facing that. A lot of the middle class has run out, but the religious dictatorship was smart enough to allow a lot of them to operate as long as they didn't oppose, the rule of the religious leaders. And now that's changing, and that's scaring them. And it goes on and on. Afghanistan never really had a middle class because they were always basically a very primitive area. I mean, people like to say Afghanistan's never been successfully invaded. That's nonsense. Look at a good history of Afghanistan. They've been invaded many times, but the invader comes, does what they have to do, and turns around and says, let's go on. And it was a place worth conquering under certain circumstances, but it was not a place worth staying in. And so it was just like a black hole in the map. There are many areas like that in the world. They eventually get gobbled up by some empire and just be administered. But they exist. Kurdistan is another matter. Kurdistan is one of the rare conflicts we have still going on. That this conflict going on simultaneously in Turkey, Iran, Syria, and Iraq, where you have very capable, in other words, middle class, economically viable, organized minorities who all share a common, culture and want an independent, Kurdistan, but they're not going to get it because they all have the misfortune of being made part of various local empires, especially the Turkish and the Iranian, and that it's a shame, it's a tragedy, but it's there. It's a constant risk. It's constantly stirring up problems in all these countries because nasty things are done to suppress these rebellious Kurds. And every time we've been any foreign power, like the United States in Iraq or in Syria, or even during the Syrian civil war, the Kurds were always the most capable local forces. And they were technically rebels, but they would cooperate with the Assad, government if it suited both their interests. And they're still willing to do that. The problem is, and this is ironic as hell, that the Turks do not want an autonomous, Kurdish region in northeastern Syria, because they saw what happened over in Iraq. They become so powerful, they're much more difficult to control, and they become a potential, how should I put it, tinder, a place for a true Kurdistan movement to get started and work. Now, another middle class, chaos problem is Pakistan. Pakistan has been a problem ever since it was, formed out of British India back in the after World War II. India basically created first a political miracle. Now they're trying to finally catch up with the economic miracle. But India created a actually functioning federal democracy, the largest one in the world. And it's a ramshackle operation, a lot of problems, but it works. The elections are fairly fair by world standards. Pakistan, on the other hand, drifted into basically military dominated, as the old saying goes. It's an army with a country attached. And although many Pakistanis looking over what's going on in India said, hey, why don't we, India's pulling ahead of us. Why don't we operate how they do? The army said, no. India's the threat. Everybody was the threat as far as the army was concerned. And that's basically a scam, which they're still getting away with. But to do that, they have to keep stoking wars in Afghanistan, in parts of India, Kashmir. And their tentacles, as it were, have shown up in other states that aren't even adjacent to Pakistan, like Burma and Bangladesh, which used to be part of Pakistan, and even Central Asia. And they've allied with China, who understands that problem and has taken care of it. You basically ally with people who have similar problems, and in China's case, have more effective solutions. But the Chinese solutions basically involve, extremely violent, reprisals of any anti-state activity. And the Pakistanis just haven't got the wherewithal to actually implement that. So the pot simmers. It's still a very, how should I put it, big source of local, regional, instability. Iran is serving the same purpose. The Iranians have always been the local superpower. They're clashing with the Turks, or before that, the Romans. The Iranians basically, they've always been more into technology, education, highly organized, state structures. They also had a big thing with civil wars. But the Arabs fear them because the only thing that the Arabs have gotten in the last, 60, 70 years is over $1 trillion in oil wealth. And as the Saudis and many of the other Gulf Arab oil states have discovered, oil money isn't enough. And now they're rapidly trying to adapt to the oil is going to eventually run out, or at least run down, not be as abundant. They're finally facing the music after 50 years of putting most of the cash into consumption and not into building an infrastructure, a economic infrastructure. And although Iran, portrays the Arabs as the inefficient, threat to world peace, it's actually the Iranians who are the bigger threat and the more serious threat. The Saudis, the Gulf Arabs, are trying to fix things, and the Iranians simply want to do what they've always done and take over things.
Dan, let me pick up a couple of things. Jim's just a segue. Iranian meddling has turned so many other countries against the Iranians, and meddling like they're doing in Syria, violent meddling in Syria and Yemen as well, and virtually on every inhabited continent, with possible exception of Australia, the Iranians have used terror and crime, and bribery, and also smuggling, when I say crime, to stir the pot. They've created a lot of enemies, but they've also, as Jim pointed out, their own population, well, not just their middle class, but I would even say some of their rural poor have had it with the failures of the Ayatollah dictatorship. See some instability there, possibly. But you were asking about things that maybe may come to fore in 2019. I'll add another one. I think it's already breaking out now. And my column this week on Chinese spies getting blowback. China's part and parcel of the economic and diplomatic war that the United States and Japan, I'll say, take U.S. and Japan and Australia as the leaders on this, are waging with the People's Republic of China right now. But it's not just those three. I think you could include several other countries, South Korea as another example. But the biggest pressure coming from the U.S. and Japan and Australia to oppose many of the devious economic and diplomatic initiatives that Beijing is attempting to execute. And the spying and intellectual property theft is so egregious that now you're seeing, we saw that in December, the U.S. get Canada to arrest the senior financial officer of a major Chinese telecommunications company that many defense and intelligence officials and very well-informed journalists think operates as a front for Beijing, Chinese intelligence, and that is a big deal. You could argue that this company, and Jim, am I pronouncing it right? Huawei.
Huawei.
Yahweh. Yeah, that's right.
Huawei.
Okay. engaged in various acts of war. Hey, nation spy. But this has been portrayed itself as being engaged in commercial projects. It's not the only one. To give you some roots on it, as I do in the column in February of last year, you had the Director of National Intelligence, CIA, FBI, and the like testifying in the Senate Intelligence Committee that they wouldn't buy these projects and products of these companies, and they were very, very suspicious of their activities. But now, blowback, legal warfare against the illegal activities, and the theft of intellectual property has damaged, well, I'll just say, numerous countries, not just in the West or American allies. And when I'm saying West, free markets, because South Korea and Japan and Taiwan certainly, and Singapore all make that cut. They've damaged individual, genuine commercial companies by stealing their intellectual property, their patents, and the like, and then using it for their own commercial purposes. And the Chinese pay no royalties, and they've gotten away with it because if you try to prosecute them inside China, it's all is lost in the dictatorship and cronyism. Well, is this a shooting war that fits the typical mold? No, it's not. But I'll tell you what, it is. This is big league. Do we cover it? Yeah, a lot of this gets covered when Jim writes about Korea and China and the like, and then when I come back and specify an issue like this. But I think we're going to see a lot more of this lawfare, legal warfare, diplomatic warfare, and there'll be an economic dimension, which in the economic dimension is the United States imposing tariffs and punishing mainland China for these activities in an attempt to encourage, through a mild coercion, the Beijing to stop it and control it. And that arrest of the senior executive is an example of what some folks call legal power. It certainly is legal power. Of course, right now China has gone and done what? They've arrested, I read, 12 or 13 Canadian citizens who are in China. All of them seem to be businessmen and women, and they essentially taken hostages. That's what the Chinese government did, because they want Canada to send this executive back to Beijing and not allow her to be extradited to the United States. I would call that diplomatic and legal warfare. It's not bullets, but it's the kind of predecessory action that could lead to bullets.
One of the things I'm interested in, Jim, is the ongoing friction between India and China. What is the potential there for any, flare-ups or is it like Austin's talking about? It's going to be economic warfare.
Well, there is no real economic warfare between China and India because India is such a large and a different market. Yes, the Indians do buy a lot of Huawei phones. They'll buy the inexpensive but high quality smartphones that Chinese firms like Huawei turn out. But they have paid attention to the security problems. India is not so much worried about intellectual property, patents. They've never been a huge producer of patents because it wasn't until the 90s they realized, our socialist approach maybe isn't working out so well. So bingo, they finally got religion more than a decade after the Chinese, and they're trying to catch up. But they have far more problems with corruption. That's another story. But the Indian problems are mainly, China wants big chunks of India, which at one point in time or in the past, could theoretically be called under, Chinese control. But it's a very vague and not a strong claim, and it hasn't been exercised. It hasn't been brought up for a long time. And the areas in question are really mountainous or jungle, not populated. They're not economically valuable. It's more, a matter of, nationalism. You can't just, cut our country apart as you wish. But if the Chinese want to go after something, no matter how powerful the target country is, they will do it. Right now, the Indian claims are on hold because the Chinese fear they have more problems to deal with, a resurgent United States, the trade war, which is hitting them where it really hurts, the continuing problems in North Korea, and, of course, the more countries basically forming an alliance in the South China Sea and being extremely, how should I put it, impolite when China tries to assert any kind of authority in the South China Sea. So they realize, all right, let's put this on hold for a while, but they'll come back to it. But I wanted to make a point. One of the first victims of the intellectual property theft for China was not the West, but was Russia. After the Soviet Union collapsed, and basically the Great Red Army basically disappeared. Poof, 80% of it, was gone. Russia suddenly didn't have a huge, army, soldiers in Far Eastern Russia on the Chinese border. And basically, the Russian Far East, which was actually, the claims were revived by Mao Zedong, after the Korean War. They were basically unprotected, and the Chinese had nuclear weapons, so it was a nuclear stalemate. But the Chinese began blatantly stealing Russian military technology. We've covered this in Strategy Page, and really this is no secret. But they were stealing aircraft designs, engine designs, weapons designs, and what have you. But one thing we noted was that although they would copy this stuff and build it for themselves, if it was a clear, rights violation, if you put it before any, even-handed judge, said, well, yeah, this new Chinese aircraft is basically a copy of the SU whatever, or the MiG-20 something. They would not export it. The only aircraft they export are the ones that they have clear title to the intellectual property behind it. And they still haven't been able to make a deal with the Russians. They had a truce. They finally made a truce with the Russians after 2000. And it's questionable if the Chinese are really, obeying it. But they really don't need it anymore. They've stolen so much intellectual property from the United States and the West that they can basically start, and they have been doing that, basing their new internal, or completely Chinese designs like the J-20 stealth fighter and the J-35 on their own work, original work based upon stolen American technology. And that's one reason why, and a lot of people don't understand that. Most Americans don't appreciate the scope of the stolen property, intellectual property. And this stuff is extremely valuable. I mean, the Apple computer makes a large chunk of its income from its patent royalties. Companies that spend billions, tens of billions of dollars on research over decades, they get patents on a lot of those new ideas. And when they suddenly become extremely valuable commercially, they expect to get paid. They got to make the money back. Otherwise, who's going to invest that kind of money in new technology? I mean, this is the foundation of basically the Western economic miracle. And the Chinese say, well, all right, but you owe us. They come up with all sorts of excuses. China's been crapped on for 2 centuries. I mean, China basically crapped on itself, but you can't. They wouldn't even accept that as an opening argument. And they just ignore it, and they get away with it. And the Chinese people, they say, well, hey, that's cool. We've always rolled. But it's not the way that the industrialized world rolls, and that's what this trade war is basically about. And it's basically shipping wealth and job potential back to the United States. And a lot of Americans understand that, even though it's politically incorrect, to put it in those terms. But it is basically about America took a big hit economically. That means people lost jobs. Assets became, less valuable because the Chinese just stole it, and they're still stealing it. Some people say the cyber war is going to be a big war, but it has been technically for that bunch for years, for over a decade. But the thing is, cyber war, stealing technology via the internet, has been around for a long time. It's become more endemic as more modern economies become dependent upon this connectivity, for much economic progress. All progress comes with some, hidden prices they don't tell you about. It's like buying a used car. And the problem is that the hackers, it's easy to hide your tracks, and it's not impossible. So it's possible to say, hey, all these attacks have come from Northern China, et cetera, et cetera. But to find a court that will basically look at that evidence and make a fair decision on it is impossible, because these are national level, conflicts, as it were. And the Chinese basically, they don't recognize. I mean, an international court, UN court, arbitration on naval matters, she ruled against them in the South China Sea, and they said, well, we don't ignore it. We refuse to accept your jurisdiction. And so they've been doing that for a long time. They make their own rules. And this is where they're getting into a problem with the rest of the industrialized world, who are basically saying, all right, the United States is taking the lead. They're saying enough. If you want to enjoy the benefits of our world economy, you got to play by some of the rules. And this is why the trade war, as it were, right now it's just a lot of basically shouting and arm bending. But China's running scared because they are the more vulnerable side of this. They're not completely, at the mercy of the United States or the West, but they are the ones who could basically trip and fall more easily than the United States, and that's why it's dangerous, because they will of course blame this on American aggression and call for more severe countermeasures. They won't. China doesn't really want to get into a war. I mean, they can do the math and realize any war, any especially large scale war, even if it's non-nuclear, is going to ruin the new bright and shiny productive Chinese economy. And that is political suicide for what is still a communist police state. They basically made a deal with the Chinese people. Cooperate with us and you can get rich. I mean, they literally said that Deng Xiaoping, in the 1980s. It is glorious to get rich as long as you don't threaten the state. And Chinese can understand that, because that's basically been the basic rule in Chinese empires for over thousands of years. But as soon as you hit people in the paycheck, especially since they have millions of families for the first time in their long family histories, they've tasted, affluence. And they say, hey, this is good. And now you're going to take it away? It doesn't work. And so that's why China is going to be, a potential hotspot for a long time to come, because things do not change fast in China.
Okay, Dan, Jim just essentially reinforced what I said about how this is this multi-pronged, multi-dimensional. But this is a part of that big confrontation between China, I'd say China, and the rest of the, let's put it in quotation marks, commercially honest most of the time world. And that's where the economic warfare is really the most potent tool that the U.S., and not just the U.S., Japan, South Korea, Europe has vis-a-vis Beijing. There's also another component, and I'm going to get a little, now down into the covert. I hate the term hybrid war, because war has always been a hybrid. But a lot of these places where the Chinese have moved in as neo-imperialists, and they talked about it in Venezuela, also see it in Congo, those folks, the regime changed there, and then I went back to anger. Well, anger can be expressed in a lot of ways, but we tossed you guys out. We don't recognize the deals the dictatorship made with Beijing, and then China's left trying to use some of these legal mechanisms, which Beijing ignores, and trying to use those to get its investment back. This is why when the U.S. Washington talks to Beijing, why don't you guys play it straight, because it can come back and bite you too. And what Jim was referring to about when he said the naval, it was maritime rights in the South China Sea, because the Philippines filed in the Hague's Court of Arbitration using the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which China signed without coercion and was an advocate of. The Philippines had signed that. They used that as the basis for the decision, and 99.5% of the Filipino complaints, I'm saying overwhelming number, depending on how you would arrive at 99%, overwhelmingly, the Philippines complaints were supported by the court. And China, as Jim said, just ignored it. Okay, you guys are going to play by the rules. Is this a war? It's an economic war. Maybe that's a good place to end it today.
I think so. We've covered a lot of space, and it's going to be interesting to watch this year, as it is all the years that we've been in business. And we'll talk to you gentlemen next time.
Goodbye, guys.
Bye.